back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. To survive in this country as a diabetic is a challenge that many of us non-diabetics, I don't think fully perceive, because it's a challenge that takes place on many levels, from the biological to the social, and of course to the economic and to the political. And here to talk about that with us now is Laura Marston. Laura is an attorney. She's an activist. She is a diabetic herself, and she is the founder of a group called the Insulin Initiative. That's the insulininitiative.com, and she joins us now. So first of all, Laura, thanks for coming on the program.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And I know having diabetes in this country is not a pleasure. And one of the things, you and I were talking the other day, one of the things that struck me about it, before we get into some of the agenda issues, is that I don't think I fully realized before was the kind of day-to-day uncertainty of it, where you had to, I always knew you had to test your levels and those types of things, but it's basically something where each day is a little bit unexpected in terms of your relationship with the disease, isn't it?
Absolutely. And you know, you can do the same thing every day with diabetes and get different results every single time. So it's a chronic illness that you as the patient are largely in charge of. I mean, you know, you see a doctor every, say, 6 months, but you're having to make these decisions every 5 minutes sometimes. And it's also a large reason why traditional competition doesn't work in the insulin space, because patients are so I don't want to say attached to our insulins, but once you learn how a certain insulin works in your body, it's somewhat easier to achieve good diabetic control.
Oh, tell me a little bit more about that, Laura, because I think that's interesting. Because I think people don't understand, I certainly didn't, that different insulin formulas can have a different reaction in your body. So basically, as you're trying to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're saying is that as you're trying to maintain your levels and stay healthy, which of course is a life and death challenge, that different medications will respond differently, I guess you're saying. And therefore, if you get accustomed to one, and then a drug company or some insurance company or somebody else steps in and says you can't take it anymore, it actually affects your ability to maintain your health and your survival. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Because we as diabetics calculate and titrate our own doses of insulin, usually for me, I'd say I dose insulin about 15 to 20 times a day. And in order to learn the insulin that I use, which is Humalog insulin, I've used it since I was 14, so about 26 years now. It took me about 20 years of trial and error and of being extremely ill, learning how that insulin works in my body. Whereas, so there are biosimilars of insulins. For example, Novolog's a biosimilar of Humalog, but they, for some people, do not work identically. And for me in particular, I'm actually severely allergic to any insulin made by Novo Nordisk, based on the yeast they use in their insulin production. So there's somewhat of a natural monopoly within the insulin market that, like you said, we don't want to change once we find something that works.
And yet, what you probably find, because we find this throughout the health financing world in this country, is that your insurer changes, or the drug formulary, which is their list of approved medications, changes, or something else happens where all of a sudden, like let's say you've been using Humalog for so long and you know how to manage yourself with it. Someone comes along and says, oh, no, we're going to give you something else instead. Maybe we'll give you the biosimilar equivalent. Maybe we'll give you something else that costs us less. And to the outside world, that may seem like one's as good as another. But for you, that actually kind of plunges you into a perilous journey, it sounds like.
It does. And today is the start of that journey for me because my insurance company wants me on Novolog, which I'm allergic to. I have to get an annual prior authorization between my doctor and the insurance company every single year to get permission to continue on my Humalog insulin. And my prior authorization expired today. So it's usually a process. It'll likely take me over a month to jump through the hoops to get insurance to pay for it. But that all said, I want to point out that as a diabetic who currently has insurance, I'm one of the fortunate ones.
Yeah, and that's, this is something I don't think people understand the gravity of the situation. And we've covered it sometimes on the show, but the fact that if you don't have insurance and you're a diabetic, it's not just inconvenient, you could very well die, right?
Absolutely. If you don't have insurance as a diabetic in the United States, a single vial of insulin, which lasts me about a week and a half, is around $325. So for every week and a half I want to live for the rest of my life, that's $325. As someone who has lost insurance in the past, I was telling Richard the other day, I feel somewhat fortunate, I guess, to have been able to have been diagnosed as a child and kind of be able to plan my entire life around getting and keeping health insurance in order to afford my insulin. But even so, I graduated law school when I was 23 years old. By 25, I was licensed to practice law in 2 states, doing all these things and taking all these steps, thinking, okay, this will protect me. And even so, in 2012, the law firm I was working at, the owner passed away unexpectedly and suddenly, and his estate closed the law firm. And I lost my health insurance. And because it was prior to the Affordable Care Act, type 1 diabetes was seen as an exclusionary condition for buying insurance. So during that period, for the next 2 years, I spent over $2,800 a month, every single month, which was more than I was making just to be able to afford what I needed to keep me alive.
Is there any other country in the developed world, so-called, that you know about, Laura, that puts people through this kind of life-threatening situation?
No, not in the way that the United States does. In fact, insulin in most countries, for example, in the UK, where they have the NHS, the same vial of my insulin that's $325 costs the NHS 16 pounds, or about the equivalent of $20, and is provided for free to the patients, paid for by taxes. Then you have a system like Canada's. Canada actually has the second most expensive insulin prices in the world, just behind the United States. But Canada's is about $30 a vial for that same vial. Only in the United States is it 10 times higher and increasing. I mean, these drug companies have in tandem increased their prices by around 20% year over year over year since my diagnosis in 1996.
It's horrifying. And how many, do you know offhand, Laura Marston, how many people have diabetes in the United States?
So I believe the total number with diabetes in the US is 34 million, but of those 34 million, 7 million rely on insulin to live. And then of those 7 million, there's about 1.6 million type 1s like me, and the other, I'm not great at math, but the other percentage are type 2s that are equally reliant on insulin to survive.
So what is the difference between type 1 and type 2?
The main difference, as I understand, of course, I'm more of an expert on type 1, but type 1 is can be diagnosed at any age, but it's an autoimmune condition where my autoimmune system attacked my pancreatic beta cells, so my body is unable to produce any amount of insulin whatsoever. All humans, and this is something not everyone realizes, but every human on the planet needs insulin to live. It's the only way you can convert the food that you eat into the energy you expend. And so because I don't make any insulin, I have to replace all of the insulin I would need through injections. Type 2 diabetes, as I understand it, also large genetic component in that. The real difference being it's more, most type 2 diabetics still produce insulin, but their bodies don't use it as effectively. So they may need to add insulin in addition to what they produce so that their body effectively uses it.
I have this vague memory, Laura Marston, and again, we're talking with Laura Marston of the insulininitiative.com. I have this vague memory, and maybe I've got it all wrong, and I apologize, honestly, for not knowing more about the life of a diabetic, but I have this vague memory of a friend of my parents, older than my parents when I was a little kid, who had serious diabetes and lost a leg and had all these other terrible complications. And this was, of course, many years ago. And they had trouble treating it. And I believe he eventually died from it. Is that a story that makes sense to you?
Well, most certainly here in the United States it does, because of the price of insulin. Folks that I know, friends of mine in their early 40s who have had to ration insulin because they can't afford it, have lost limbs. I know a young lady in end-stage renal failure from rationing insulin. You know, if you don't have insulin, it's kind of hard to explain, but I'm going to do my best. As a type 1, if you have no insulin in your body, you go into what's called diabetic ketoacidosis. And essentially, your body changes from a basic state to an acidic state. So just imagine if you have acid blood pumping through all your organs, all your body, that's what happens. And that it's as excruciating as you can imagine. I mean, the worst pain I've ever felt. So, and then if untreated, in an emergency setting, then if untreated, we die 100% death every time. You know, if I unhooked my insulin pump right now, I would be comatose in about 12 hours, I would think.
Wow.
And if not treated, I would be dead within 48 to 72 hours.
And the limb loss and that kind of thing, that's from this acidic reaction in the body?
It's because our blood, obviously, we're manually doing what most people's pancreases do on their own. So we're not as proficient as a pancreas, and because of that, we have blood sugar fluctuations that are a little bit wilder than non-diabetics, and that can lead to a host of complications that affect everything from your eyes to your limbs to your vital organs.
Well, and it's a horrifying story. I mean, what's horrifying to me, I guess, Laura, is that first of all, the three inventors or discoverers of insulin, as we know, and I guess it was 1923, sold their rights to it for $1 each because they thought it should be widely available, and instead the drug companies have made it wildly expensive in this country especially. And I guess, you know, the stories that we're talking about here, and I've got to be honest, I'll always have the memory of Uncle Harry, as we called him, lying in bed with, you know, half a leg. The fact that this is all so preventable, right? I mean, this is obviously you've got a challenge. You've got to manage your insulin on a daily basis. You've got to be vigilant and on top of it. But if we had freely available, affordable insulin in this country, every diabetic, it sounds like, could live pretty much free of fear. Is that exaggerating, or is that true?
No, absolutely. I often say that I feel like I live in a country that prides itself on freedom, but I don't get to be free because I was diagnosed at 14 years old with an illness that I couldn't prevent and that I'll have for the rest of my life. And so there's definitely a feeling of otherness, but then there's also the challenge of, with our government not stepping in and doing something here, like every other country does, it leaves us as patients not only to control a chronic illness that takes 24/7, 365, but also to fight big pharma, which is a very David versus Goliath battle.
Yeah, it really is. And by the way, I'm told that our country guarantees its citizens the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I learned that in school, and it seems to me that millions of diabetics in this country are being denied all three: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So let's, Laura Marston, let's pivot to what some good goals are, what we should be fighting for. You have the group, the Insulin Initiative, and well, first of all, tell us a little bit about what it is.
So the Insulin Initiative is a coalition of grassroots independent advocates who, we're not, the Insulin Initiative isn't funded at all. In fact, it's funded by me and a couple other folks who are also patients. And it's a coalition where we can make our voices heard on this issue. Our number one goal is to push for either affordable insulin, like $20 or less a vial, that also provides for for coverage for people who can't afford that. With the ultimate goal being a Medicare for all type system, an NHS type system, a single payer type system, where the government takes on this burden for us instead of kind of feeding us to the pharmaceutical wolves on this.
Yeah, no, I absolutely understand, and I think I and most of my audience completely support that. And I noticed that, Laura, in your language at the Insulin Initiative, the words I keep seeing are affordable and accessible, right? So until we have something like Medicare for all, it has to be something people can actually afford and not die because it's too expensive. And this word accessible, it seems to me that speaks, well, you can tell me what you mean, but to me, it seems to speak to what you were talking about earlier, that if you need Humalog and not a biosimilar or something else, that you should have access to not only to affordable insulin, but the insulin that works best for you individually.
Absolutely. Exactly what you said. And I would even take it a step further and say, knowing that I need insulin 365 days, 24/7 for the rest of my life, I don't think I should need a prescription for it. You actually didn't need a prescription for insulin until around the mid-90s.
Really? That's interesting. Yep, I didn't know that. Yeah.
The older version, so recombinant insulins that came out in the late 70s, you don't need a prescription for. You only need a prescription for newer versions, which came out when I was a teenager. And that in and of itself is an unnecessary hurdle because we're going to need it for life. Why do we have to go through the motions of getting a prescription renewed? So yeah, when we say affordable and accessible, just with no hoops to jump through, it should be made freely available to us, in my opinion.
Well, so why would they demand that you get it? Well, first of all, I guess I should make clear I understand what you're suggesting, Laura. So you're suggesting maybe that a person with diabetes gets a card or something, and that's kind of lifelong. Yeah, this person has diabetes, give them insulin kind of thing.
Absolutely. Or if we had a better system, or a notation or something on your license, something of that nature.
Yeah, and then why wouldn't people be for it? I mean, the drug companies. Well, first of all, we want to ideally get them out, but they could sell more insulin. But secondly, are people afraid that people are going to be like copping black market insulin or something, cutting it up and snorting it? I mean, I know it's not cut upable, but what is, I'm just being slightly sarcastic, but what is the objection to making it freely available?
I've done a lot of research trying to actually track down who lobbied for the prescription requirement. And it's not something that's easy to track down. But what I gather from it is that the pharmaceutical companies had the plan to raise the list prices very high, had the plan to, kind of point the finger at the insurance companies. They're going to point it back, and then they both laugh at us all the way to the bank.
Right.
And I think that's the reason that the insulins nowadays require a prescription.
Yeah, we have such an insane system. My job was to be an expert in the system, and I don't understand, because it's not a rational system, but it's a brutal one. And so you've got your goals listed on the insulin initiative. Number one is pass and implement a federal insulin price cap bill. And this is, you've made the point, and others have, that even if the out-of-pocket cost is capped at $20, if they're still charging these, $2,800 a month, we, the people, are still paying. But I guess step one is is that what you're talking about here, is make the out-of-pocket cap something very affordable?
No, that would be the actual price.
Oh, the actual cost. Okay.
Yeah, the price that the manufacturers would be able to charge insurers or individuals. We want to see that capped at the federal level.
So, and why wouldn't they? I mean, we know why. Stupid question. Drug lobby has hundreds of lobbyists in Capitol Hill and give out millions and millions in campaign money. So we know why, but we got to keep pushing. Number two is remove the prescription barrier for insulin. We just talked about that, and allow all insulin to be available over the counter. Number three, okay, this is close to my heart, Laura Marston. Hold insulin manufacturers accountable for the illegal price fixing of insulin. I wish I could mentally project a chart right now to everybody listening over radio of how the prices, which are supposedly the free market dictates, how the prices for insulin from different manufacturers have risen like in lockstep, right? Like they're just right with each other, almost as if they were illegally colluding to jack up prices. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say. I just changed my background here to the price increases. I'm kind of blocking it, but you can just see it's two lines with two competing insulin products by two competitors that go up by the exact same percentage on the exact same day, time and time and time again. I believe of 28 price increases, 24 were identical. And I'm not an antitrust lawyer, but I don't think you have to be to see price fixing in the insulin market.
No, I don't think you actually have to be a lawyer, to be honest. I think you just have to be a human being with a minimum common sense to see that this is outrageous, and nobody has gone to jail for it. one drug executive, I don't know if, I think they sell insulin, I'm not sure, but one pharma executive became Secretary of Health and Human Services. But we haven't seen, that was obviously Trump's guy, but we haven't seen either party jump in and stop this yet, and we really need to. So when you say hold insulin manufacturers accountable for the illegal price fixing of insulin, I don't just want to see this stop. I want to see people in orange jumpsuits doing a perp walk. I know that's me.
I'm right there. I'm right there with you. I want to see the FTC issue subpoenas. I want to see the FTC dig through the documents that they need to and give us an explanation for why 25% of diabetics can't afford the insulin we need to live. I think that the pharmaceutical companies should have to pay, both from a legal standpoint, if that's appropriate with criminal charges, but also from a standpoint of they shouldn't continue to be able to extort us for our lives like this. Yeah, like you said, there's a lot of money that goes into lobbying, but when you're selling a product that 7 million people die without, you can print money.
Do we know this is yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's like blackmail, right? It's like a ransom note to 7 million people. Do you know offhand, Laura, and it's a grim question, but how many people die each year because they can't afford their insulin in this country?
Well, we don't know for sure, unfortunately, because as I'm sure you can imagine, and your listeners can imagine, that some go under the radar, but of the calculable cases, I know of 15, 20 off the top of my head in the past few years where their families have become advocates on this issue and have told their stories, or their friends. And I mean, these stories are horrible, and it's all young diabetics in their 20s, and a lot of racial minorities, which, just it makes that part of the equation really bleakly obvious. But yeah, so it's not a quantifiable number, but a lot. We actually had a month, I believe this was in 2019, where some of us were keeping track of that, as morbid and grim as it sounds. And in that month, four young people died in the States from not being able to afford insulin.
It's horrifying. And Laura, before we go, I also want to talk about your point number 4, supporting the ongoing efforts of Medicare for All. The Affordable Care Act eliminated the pre-existing conditions problem that you used to have. But I know from looking at a lot of Affordable Care Act plans, a lot of the plans on the exchanges, that you can get health insurance on the exchanges under the Affordable Care Act and still have, $5,000 in deductibles after paying a significant amount in premiums. And I would think that, particularly for a young diabetic or anyone between jobs as a diabetic, and you go on the plan, yes, it's better than nothing. But if you have to spend $5,000 or $2,500 out of pocket before you start getting reimbursed, I would imagine, and maybe you don't get reimbursed 100%, I don't know, I would imagine that still excludes a lot of people from getting the insulin they need right now.
Absolutely. And that's what happened to Alex Smith. His mom, a friend of mine, Nicole Smith Holt, her son, he was diagnosed a little bit later in life, around 23 or 24. He aged off his mom's insurance at 26, and he died 23 days later from rationing his insulin, because, like you said, his options were an extremely expensive Affordable Care Act plan, or he thought he could use the money he would spend towards premiums just paying for insulin. I don't think anyone really expects insulin to be as expensive as it is. And so it's a shock to all of us, every time we go to the pharmacy.
So even foregoing the premiums, Alex didn't, he bought what he could, but it wasn't enough. He tried to stretch it because, as you pointed out, it's a constant, management act to try to get it right. He took a chance and he lost, right? And that's how we lose young people, other people to this disease because of our effed up, excuse my language, economic system for funding healthcare. Well, before we go, the last section on your page here that I'm looking at is how we fight. You want to say a couple things about that before we conclude?
Well, I would ask anyone listening to support the grassroots efforts for a true price cap at the federal level. There have been a lot of bills that are tossing around right now in Congress. The proposals are merely to cap copays for those who can afford insurance. The danger of that is, while that may help some people financially, really the people struggling, the people dying, people rationing are those who are uninsured due to no fault of their own. So I would ask you all to listen when the politicians talk, and I always call it the Alex Smith test. But he was uninsured. Would this legislation have saved Alex Smith? And for me, if the answer is no, I don't support it. We're pushing for a true price cap and ultimately a true system where every diabetic gets insulin for free, just like non-diabetics do.
And you also talk, before you go, you also talk about, and I was struck by this, developing organizers. That, so I guess I would say some people listening to this program right now or watching it are diabetics themselves. And you talk about building a community organizing engine. You talk about helping to connect advocates and organizers. And so what can people do? If I'm, let's say, young, doesn't have to be young diabetic out there listening to this program, is there anything I can do to start organizing, working with other people on this issue?
Well, one of the easiest things you can do is log on to social media. A lot of us are on Twitter. I'm at KidFears99. But if you use the hashtag or search for the hashtag insulin for all, number 4, you can find that's basically what the umbrella under which we do our organizing. But I would also add that I'm a perfect example of anyone can cause ripples and everyone's story is important. I felt that same way, just kind of, what can I do about this? How can I fight back? And I reached out with my story to a journalist years ago, and my story was told that way. And, the rest just kind of has happened organically from that. But I think that even folks who may still be on their parents' insurance or may have insurance right now, their stories are still huge to this, and all 7 million lives are just as important as everyone else's, and we as a country need to legislate that way.
Great, well said. And before we go, I want to also tell anybody out there with a story to tell about their own diabetes to write me at richard@thisisthezerohour.com, and we'll help you tell your story, or we'll do our best. So Laura Marston, again, the insulininitiative.com. You're doing fantastic work in this area. It's a pleasure to know you, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much, Richard. It's great to be here.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.